the mission didn't speak to the fan experience at all. So for me, coming from minor league baseball, where none of the games matter, the stats don't count effectively, like to me, I came in and it was just all about the fan experience. And I sort of found myself feeling a bit like an alien among the women's professional soccer folks, where it was all about getting either all or at least a quorum of what were perceived to be the best players in the world, because that was the measuring stick of legitimacy. And in a way, I think the league founders boxed themselves into a corner with that mission.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Thank you, professional announcer guy. My name is Tim Hanlon. Thank you for joining me. Good Seats Still Available is the podcast, and we are on a journey together. Thank you for joining me on the beginning stages of it as we look to explore what used to be in professional sports. My guest today is a double threat. His name is Andy Crossley, and he is interesting for two separate yet related reasons. One, he is the curator of a fascinating website that I encourage all of my listeners to check out and just roll around in. It's called funwhileitlasted.net. It is a treasure trove of all things defunct and forgotten in pro sports. You will lose a lot of time, but gain a lot of knowledge from that website. And he has meticulously curated stories and anecdotes and interviews and memorabilia around teams and leagues that aren't around anymore. Obviously, a fascinating first guest to pursue for that reason alone. However, Andy is also interesting from another point of view, and that is as a general manager for a team in the second, I guess, incarnation of women's professional sports soccer here in the United States called WPS, Women's Professional Soccer. In the latter part of the first decade of the 2000s, Andy was the general manager of the Boston Breakers franchise that frankly existed in its original form in the league that preceded the WPS, the Women's United Soccer Association, or WUSA, and succeeds or exists today in the successor to WPS itself, called the NWSL, the National Women's Soccer League. There's a whole tortured history of those three leagues, the WPS sitting in the middle of them, and how women's professional soccer continues to grow despite various shots in the foot along the way. And that's what we'll get to with Andy as well, which I think you'll find deeply fascinating and instructive. Before we get to Andy, though, I just want to remind you, our website, goodseatsstillavailable.com. Please check it out. You can send us some email. You can subscribe to our email list, of course. And on social media, you can find us on Twitter at goodseatsstill. Find us on Instagram at goodseatsstillavailable. You'll find us on Facebook. We have a Facebook page for that too, etc. But let's waste no more time. Let's get to our conversation with Andy Crossley from a few weeks back. Why don't we start with perhaps how you and I kind of got connected? Funwhileitlasted.net is, for those of our listeners who are not aware of it, is an amazing treasure trove of forgotten sports history. I discovered it, I don't know, maybe 2011, 2012. Andy, you are the curator, the originator, the biographer, I guess, of forgotten sports teams and leagues through Fun While It Lasted. How about some background as to sort of how that even came about?
I think I wrote the first post in the winter of 2011. And at the time, I was the general manager of the Boston Breakers, which is a women's professional soccer team, still exists today in the National Women's Soccer League. But at the time, the Breakers were part of a different league called Women's Professional Soccer. We were a couple months out from what proved to be the league's final season, and that was painfully obvious that was going to be the case. And so I think I was very much aware of the mortality of the team and my own job. And although that team ended up enduring, I just always been sort of fascinated by the the business lives of these teams outside of the major leagues that have come and gone, and realized that I was part of that process and had been many times in my career, and that there are often a lot of sort of outlandish stories that happen in the sort of wild west, where a lot of these either minor leagues or kind of entrepreneurial startup leagues exist. And so as I was in my sort of final year, knowing it was going to be my final year in this pro soccer league, I thought it'd be a good practice to sort of archive some of the stories that I witnessed as I went along, but also to write about some of the other teams that fascinated me, either from before my own time or that I had watched growing up that had come and gone.
Well, we're going to get into the Boston Breakers' specific experiences in a little while, because there's a treasure trove of stories relating to them and women's professional soccer. But I'm just struck by the depth and the richness of some of these stories. It looks like you've also somehow been a collector, or perhaps by default have seen collections of the things that were indeed left behind, like programs and guides and various other memorabilia, almost maybe perhaps by default. But in those pictures, in those items, there's a whole bunch of unearthed history in there too, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you visit the site, there's about 1,000 teams that are chronicled there from every imaginable league, from pre-World War II minor league baseball to lingerie football league teams. And there's probably about 10,000 images of, sort of memorabilia that these teams have left behind, especially, programs and media guides and press releases and things that sort of tell the visual history of these teams and also the eras in which they operated. And the site's also kind of evolved over time, because, like I said, when I started it, I was working in the industry, and this was 6 years ago. And so I really had access to a lot more stories. Now I've been out of the industry for about 5 years, still working in sports, but in the nonprofit youth development world. And so the site has sort of, out of necessity, evolved a little bit away from sort of my personal diary and experience and into a little bit more of sort of like an encyclopedia, an image archive type of site, which is, good and bad. I kind of miss the stories. And actually, I had so many, over the 15 years or so that I worked in pro sports front offices, there's so many times when I would sit down with friends who work for different teams, and they'd be thinking about getting out and going into a sort of straighter line of work. And inevitably they'd be like, but I'd really miss the stories. And it was like, that was like a big motivation for a lot of people to stay in, is like, just that in any given day, the strangest characters and the weirdest things could happen to you. And it was a definite part of the allure.
Well, so that's a perfect segue into. Can you give some insight to some of the more standout stories or fascinating things, or maybe even oddities that kind of stand out in your mind? I mean, I can give you my favorites, but they're just some amazing stories that I frankly, I think are very rich and probably capable of being told as book stories or even movies and all those kinds of things. What things stand out for you based on what you've seen in your sort of labor of love over the last number of years with this?
Yeah, I mean, everybody who's worked in minor league sports says they're going to write a book someday. Most of them don't, but there's a lot on Amazon, that 5 people have bought, 5 friends and family members, because everybody's got so many good stories. But the 2 sports that I spent most of my time in were minor league baseball and professional soccer. They're a little bit different, but, one of the things that's really interesting about minor league baseball from a sort of storytelling perspective is that it's this sort of crossroads where everybody's either on their way up or on their way down. And, which is what Bull Durham's about, right? you've got Nuke LaLoosh on his way up, and then you've got, Kevin Costner on his way out, Crash Davis. So, I remember the first game that I worked in minor league baseball in 2001. So opening day of the 2001 season, I was the PR director for a team in New Hampshire called the Nashua Pride. So my first day was also Jose Canseco's first minor league baseball game in 15 years. And he had been in the 2000 World Series for the New York Yankees. He had at the time something like 470 home runs, 460. He was within a good season of 500 home runs. And at that point in time, no one with 500 major league home runs had ever been denied the Hall of Fame. So it was a big deal about whether he was going to get that 500 or not. And, the Yankees had cut him loose. He had gone to spring training with the Anaheim Angels, and they had cut him. And so he had signed to play independent baseball in the Atlantic League with a team called the Newark Bears for $6,000 a month for 4 months. And even that paltry salary had required a vote of the league's board of directors to approve because it was double the league maximum. So the Bears were opening on the road in Nashua, New Hampshire at my ballpark. And I had been working this job for 3 months. And by virtue of working there 3 months, I had become the third most senior person on the staff. I'm sorry.
No pressure there.
Yeah, the fourth most senior person on the staff. The girl who was number 3 had started 5 days before me. So, normally the Pride had 2 press who covered the team. There was a beat writer from the local newspaper, and there was a stringer from the big newspaper in New Hampshire, 30 miles north up in Manchester, who was he wasn't even on the staff. He was a substitute school teacher, a stand-up comedian, and he was the stringer part-time writer who covered Nashua Pride.
Perfect qualifications, no?
Yeah. So in a normal game, those were the 2 guys in the press box, along with the local radio crew. But because Canseco was playing, we had 80 press credentials for that day. CNN was there. All 4, Sports Illustrated was there. All 3 of the major network news trucks out of Boston had trucks there to do live remotes. Canseco had played for the Red Sox, so that was an additional angle. I had a whole section of stands that was just cordoned off for press because they couldn't fit in the press box at this little, 5,000-seater ballpark. And Canseco himself had really played up the notoriety of the event because he was claiming he was being blackballed from Major League Baseball for reasons I don't recall anymore.
No, it's his road to redemption, essentially, or at least
yeah. This is before he wrote Juiced, by the way. It's a couple years
right,
before.
Sure.
So, he came out. He gave a press conference. He didn't take the team bus from New Hampshire. He drove up in his SUV with his twin brother Ozzie, who also played in the league and was the reigning league most valuable player. So Jose and Ozzie drove up separately, and I happened to be out front of the stadium when they pulled in a couple hours earlier, and they got out of the car with these two girls who looked like they were about 15 years old, and there was a guy setting up the hot dog concession right next to me when they came out of the stadium, and I looked over at him because he was the only guy around, and he just looked back at me and raised an eyebrow, and he said, "Those must be their nieces." So he came in and, he was there for a 3-game homestand. It was we sold out 3 games in a row. But that night, the night after opening day, the whole staff and all the interns, we convened at the general manager's apartment to do all of the laundry for both teams. Because the person who usually does that in minor league baseball is called the clubby.
Yep.
The clubhouse manager. It's one of the worst jobs in America. And they work entirely on tips. And last year's clubby had not only quit, which is not unusual, from year to year to have your minor league clubby quit. But he not only quit, but he had loaded up the team's laundry machines into the back of his truck, and he had disappeared into the middle of America somewhere. So we not only had no clubby, we had no laundry machines. So we had to do all the team's laundry at the general manager's apartment. And it was about 3 a.m, and we'd finally washed these 50 uniforms and dried them and stacked them and folded them. And one of the interns was going through the piles, and he said, Canseco's jersey is missing. And
of all people.
Of all people. And they only travel with one. So, and he's a pretty big guy. So
how did he handle it?
We scoured the place, and I think at like 4 a.m, we found it stuck to the inside of a dryer on like the 8th floor of this guy's apartment complex, because we had needed like every laundry machine in all of the buildings of his complex to do all this laundry. And it was just crazy. And he and Canseco ended up going to the local Mexican restaurant that was our Wednesday night, 2-for-1 hot dog sponsor. I'm not sure why a Mexican restaurant was our 2-for-1 hot dog sponsor, but he went there and he ended up stiffing them on a bill, which they then put in a frame and left up for the rest of the summer.
So at what point in the play out of that story, and at what point do you question your sanity as a career choice for the oddities both that you've experienced and maybe arguably then were yet to come in your career?
No, I mean, at that point, you're 23 or 24 years old, and it's awesome, And like I said, like I perceive myself as on the way up, and he was clearly sort of on the way down. He actually did end up getting back to the majors that year, and he hit the final 16 home runs of his career and ended up, 20 short or something like that. But he was clearly kind of at the end, as were a lot of players in the Atlantic League. But there were also young players there. It wasn't really a prospect league, but there were players on the way up, and certainly the people in the front office perceived themselves as being on the way to some destination. And a lot of times the difference in age of those people wasn't that different. So you'd have a recent grad who was 23 or 24 who really thought they were on their way to being a general manager in the major leagues or a sales director for the Boston Red Sox or whatever it would be. And then you'd have a baseball player who was 25, but had been drafted right out of high school and had played 6 or 7 years already and was, had washed out of the affiliated minor leagues and was clearly on the way out. And, these are people that you spent the whole summer with and, in some cases socialized with. And it was just a really interesting dynamic.
So how did that then spill over? So it almost feels like it's not only in your career, and we'll get to the WPS part of it in a minute, because I really want to go deep on that, because the idea around this podcast is kind of, telling those stories around leagues and teams that for whatever reason are no longer with us. But what compelled you to not only share that story on your website and again here, but all those other stories as well? It almost feels like there's a psychology to it, or some kind of other essence to, I don't know, the frivolity or the oddity or the just unique nature of these teams and leagues and people that, for whatever reason, somehow either didn't make it or was part of their careers, like you say, either going up or going down.
Yeah, I think whether people are going up or going down, there is sort of like a nobility, like a weird kind of nobility to what they're doing. There were, I would say, especially in baseball, there were players there that needed money and didn't really know what else to do. Didn't necessarily have a lot of other skills to fall back on. And there was an allure to that too, because, you could play on the Nashua Pride, which was not a especially successful team. You probably played typically to about 1,800 people a night. But we had players on that team who were in the off season, who had, in some cases, played in the major leagues. In the off season, they were hospital orderlies, or there's a couple guys who loaded packages onto planes for Federal Express at the airport in like Cincinnati and Kentucky. A couple guys did that, and that's what they did all winter. And then in the summer, they were not only paid to play baseball, but they had groupies and they had kids with their baseball cards asking for their autograph. You can see why that would be difficult to give up. That lifestyle, even just beyond, the dream of, maybe I've got a couple more years left in me and a scout's going to see me. And not even necessarily a major league scout, but a lot of times the payday for these guys that were playing in independent baseball was to get picked up by Korea or Mexico and go over there and make six figures for a year. So you could see why that would be alluring, but there was also sort of, even for a guy like Canseco, who, probably nobility is not a word that's often thrown around with him, but, there were probably other things that he could have gone and done. And I don't know how much he saved his money. I know later he ended up in some financial distress, but, you do have to give him some credit that he loved to keep playing and he chose to do that. And I think, there's a lot of, on the front office side, a lot of really bright, hard-charging, energetic, a lot of cases very well-educated people who are choosing to do this kind of work for $18,000 or $22,000 a year and working 70 or 80 hours a week and really wanting the type of work that's going to be a lifestyle that doesn't, shut off late at night and it's interesting to be around people like that.
Speaking of, interesting is a kind of an understatement. On the site, you have some really interesting interviews, and I suspect that at some point you probably could even go further with them. But there's one in particular that maybe acts as a decent segue that I just thought that I'm continue to be taken by, and I'm sure you've got some thoughts about. It's a gentleman by the name of Rudy Schiffer, and in your description, you describe him. I don't know if he self-describes himself or you're describing him as the Undertaker, and he essentially kind of led that life for, I don't know, almost a dozen different teams that no longer exist in the NASL, the American Soccer League, the USFL, even the Canadian Football League when it had its dalliances with places like Shreveport and Memphis. Anything particular that sort of strikes you from that interview?
Yeah, that Rudy was great to talk to. He was probably in his mid or late 70s when I interviewed him, and I probably talked to him for 2 or 3 hours on the phone one day. And yeah, the Undertaker was his name for himself, and it was because he had buried so many teams. Yeah, he had sort of been everywhere and done everything, especially around Memphis, Tennessee. But he had also been involved with the NASL when Pele had come to America, and he was with Memphis when USFL when they had signed Reggie White out of college, plucked him away from the NFL. And he was a PR guy, so he was always trying to put the most fantastical headline-grabbing spins on anything he could. And he's also just a great storyteller. So, yeah, that was a fun one.
Well, it feels to me like there's just plenty of those kinds of stories out there. And I'm wondering, as we're going to segue into your specific experiences in WPS in a second, but are there any patterns or trends that you sort of see as you've, I don't know, by default chronicled these stories, both things that you personally experienced and heard through other people? Are there certain psyches that are drawn to the allure of sports and the American dream, so to speak? Obviously, it's a big business now. Maybe years ago, it was sort of more of a creative outlet and exercise than it was sort of a moneymaker. But any sort of things or patterns that you see with the various people and coaches and players and broadcasters, et cetera, that you've come across in your trove here that seem to resonate, or is it just sort of one big motley crew of craziness that just sort of makes up the bigger tableau?
No, there's definitely some patterns, and you can even see it in sort of different positions within the industry. But first of all, it's a very white industry. There's a lot of white guys with short hair, sort of cut from the same cloth, and So there's a lot of, like in broadcasting, for example, like in baseball broadcasting, there's a lot of like sort of geeky sabermetric guys, the kind of guys who sort of like go to the bleachers all through high school and college with their tape recorder, and they like record themselves mock broadcasting the game. It's just a recognizable type. I think another one that's really honestly sort of important to the industry continuing to run is that a lot of the industry is sort of based on the economic theory of the greater fool, which is that, if you look at investors who've made money in minor league sports, they generally made money from the sale of teams, from basically flipping teams. There's very few who've made a lot of money operating teams. And there's a lot of business models at this point that should have been essentially thoroughly debunked and thrown away, yet they continue to thrive because there's always the next guy. There's always the next guy who has always secretly fantasized or dreamed of owning a sports team. And a lot of times these guys are businessmen who've been successful in other fields. And part of their, ego in a lot of cases is that they believe that whatever they've learned in whatever other field is transferable in some way to sports. And that, they think the guy they just bought it from is the sucker who couldn't figure it out. The guy who's selling it thinks the guy he's selling it to is the sucker who can't see that this isn't going anywhere. So, there's some sports like minor league baseball that actually have a really good economic model where there's a lot of subsidy and partnership, both from the communities that teams are in terms of helping to finance ballparks or giving favorable leases, or from major league teams that are helping to underwrite the expenses of these teams as a developmental system. So I'm not saying that somebody who buys a affiliated minor league baseball team is a sucker. But somebody who buys an arena football league team is an absolute sucker.
Now, why do you say that? Is it because it's such a relatively new and untested marketplace? Or
no, the polar opposite. It's arena football is going into something like its 31st year.
Wobbly though,
this summer.
Fair.
It's going into its 31st year. It's none of the franchises have ever made money. To the extent that anyone's operated in the black, you could probably count them on one or two hands. And the challenge is, arena football teams have no partnership. The NFL doesn't, for example, underwrite the player salaries the way that Major League Baseball teams do for minor league teams. And most importantly, they're tenants in other people's buildings. And one of the really important things in this level of sport is that it's very, very difficult to survive as a tenant in someone else's building, because that means you don't control revenue streams like parking and concessions. That money all goes to somebody else, but you're paying a lot of times often exorbitant rents to play in these places. And there's no significant broadcasting revenue for leagues like this. When you see something like an indoor lacrosse game on TV or an arena football game on TV, generally the league is actually paying the production costs to be on TV as a marketing expense. They're not getting a multi-million or billion-dollar contract from Fox Sports 1 or TNN or anybody like that. So this economic model has been debunked for years and years and years, but leagues like the National Lacrosse League and the Arena Football League, they don't go anywhere because they can always find the next guy. So
well, in many respects, perhaps Major League Soccer, right? And there are clearly critics of Major League Soccer's somewhat centralized, actually completely centralized business model. But in many respects, you have to give them credit for going soccer specific as a part of the business model for a bunch of those very reasons, right? And we've seen plenty of attempts of professional soccer over the last 40 years in this country that have failed because of some of those issues you just said.
Yeah, I mean, they're a huge success story, and there's not really, I think almost the only thing you could liken them to might be the old American Football League, So, Major League Soccer now does have TV contracts that pay them substantial amounts of money. So they do have a broadcasting revenue stream that other leagues can only dream of. They do have municipalities who are helping them build state-of-the-art stadiums, which was not the case when they started, and they were playing in football stadiums and losing a lot of money. But Major League Soccer also is sort of eternally indebted to just a handful of guys like Phil Anschutz, Lamar Hunt, and Robert Kraft, who I think at one point in the late 90s, early 2000s, they were down to 3 owners who owned like every team in the league. And they lost, in their first 5 or 6 years, if I'm remembering the numbers correctly, something like $250 million on Major League Soccer. And it was only a handful of guys who were underwriting that. So very few leagues could sort of follow the path that they've taken. And they also had a sport that everywhere else in the world was the number one sport. Like there was a path that you could look at where that sport had been trod in other places, that you could see a light at the end of the tunnel if you could just get it right, despite how many other people had failed at it in America. For a lot of these other sports like lacrosse or arena football or whatever, or any women's professional sport, you don't have, you can't look across the pond at like the English Premier League and say, maybe we could be like that. You've got to visualize it yourself and do it yourself, and that's an additional hurdle. But the reason I compared it to the American Football League, which interestingly enough is a Lamar Hunt, story, is that Lamar Hunt really got that started. And there's a famous story that's I think everybody agrees it's an apocryphal story. But when the AFL started,
but that's never going to stop us from having those stories told on this podcast. So go right ahead.
That's right.
And I'm sure our listeners, eventually, as we get listeners, will correct us or correct our guests if they're somewhat off base. But go right ahead.
Yeah, and I'd imagine that anybody who's listening to your podcast probably knows who Lamar Hunt is. But if they don't, he's one of the great sportsmen in American or world history. He started the American Football League, was the owner of the Kansas City Chiefs. He was one of the founders of the North American Soccer League and operated the Dallas Tornado franchise there for 15 years, which is longer than anybody else hung on in soccer at that stage. And then he was one of the founders of Major League Soccer, and he backstopped several Major League Soccer franchises over the years, including the Dallas, Kansas City, and Columbus franchises. And his children today, he's deceased now recently, but his children continue to operate the Kansas City Chiefs and be involved in Major League Soccer, I believe. But, when he started the AFL in 1960, I think he was a young man, and he had an oil fortune he'd inherited from his father. And the apocryphal story is that, a press conference of sort of skeptical sports writers had said, your son's going to lose like $1 million a year doing this. This is a really stupid idea. And his father said, well, if that's the case, I guess he's only going to be able to hang on for 150 years. And that, that's one of the guys that let Major League Soccer get through that enormous, bloodletting that they went through between 1996 and 2002 before, Don Garber arrived and the stadium projects got a little bit more momentum. And Lamar Hunt was the first one to get a soccer-specific stadium in Major League Soccer. He got one in Columbus. So he really started that movement and that boom, which, has been indispensable to that league's success.
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, Michael McCambridge, as you probably know, wrote a book called Lamar Hunt, Life in Sports, which I recently finished. I believe actually Michael lives in my hometown here in Lake Forest, Illinois, on the short list because the stories about people like a Lamar Hunt, without them in the darkest of times, you don't get to 24 and counting franchises in a Major League Soccer, despite still centralized ownership. But at least it's going on, it's well into its third decade now, and or second decade, with strength, and that's clearly something other professional soccer leagues have not enjoyed. And this is the sort of inelegant segue into your experiences in professional soccer, in particular WPS, women's professional soccer, which our audience probably knows, or if they don't, should know, was the second real attempt in the wake of the WUSA that preceded it, the Women's United Soccer Association, to do a full-fledged professional women's soccer league here in the United States. And I guess you could make the argument that, aside from the success of the national women's team relative to that of the men's, and the success of that, and the uniqueness of that could have been, to your point earlier, an opportunity to create the best league for women soccer players in the world, which would be unique and different and special, not unlike the NHL in hockey or the Major League Baseball for baseball. Right? Those are the not even argued best leagues of their kind in their sports in the world. But assuming all of that, how did you even get involved with a fledgling soccer league, let alone that of a pure women's variety, especially after the first attempt flamed out so magnificently with lots of money down the drain?
My first job in sports was actually working in the 96 Atlanta Olympics as a college student. But my first sort of office job in sports was as an intern for a minor league soccer team. It was a minor league team to the New England Revolution called the Boston Bulldogs. And the guy who was the president of the team at the time was named Joe Cummings, really respected soccer executive. He'd worked in the New England Revolution front office, and he actually left that job while I was an intern to help start up the WUSA, Women's United Soccer Association, in 2000, which was really launching on the back of the 99 U.S. victory in the Women's World Cup. And that had, attracted 90,000 people to the Rose Bowl. The television ratings were through the roof. They had sold out Soldier Field and Giant Stadium in some of the earlier round matches. And that got the attention of cable TV operators. So a group of cable TV operators had come together to fund this league. And Boston had a franchise called the Boston Breakers. The league played 3 years. It was very successful, to what you were just saying, in becoming the best league in the world. And it signed all the best players, both American and international. But they just burned through money. And they lost $100 million in 3 years, and they folded after their third season in 2003. So, like I said, there's always a greater fool. There's always people who want to bring it back. And so a group of people came together and said, all right, let's learn from their lessons and try another league. And Boston had been one of the best operated franchises and most popular teams in the first go-around. So Joe Cummings was recruited to come back and restart the Breakers franchise in this new league, WPS. And so he actually came to a minor league baseball game in Brockton, Massachusetts, where I was the general manager of the team and the stadium. And he was just taking notes. He was on a sort of tour of ballparks and stadium around New England to take notes on fan experience and game day production. And I bumped into him in the crowd, basically, and hadn't seen him in 8 years, and struck up a conversation. And I was about to get married and getting a little bit worn down by doing, upwards of, 80, 90 events a year. And so I asked him to have lunch with me, and sort of one thing led to another, and ended up right after I got married on the pitcher's mound at our stadium, I gave my 2 weeks notice and went to work for Joe, starting up the Breakers in this new league. And that was in the fall of 2007. We didn't take the field until the spring of 2009. So I got to be part of about an 18-month startup. It wasn't actually supposed to be that way. It was supposed to start in 2008. But one of the great challenges and sort of bad karma of that league was that we got to start it right in the teeth of the recession.
Well, and it's interesting to hear it, because it sounds like it's also there's a more perceived stability coming from your minor league experiences.
I think no. I think I knew exactly what I was getting into, but more money for 10 games a year instead of, less money for 70 games and 5 concerts and 10 bar mitzvahs and 3, circuses and all the other things that we had on the field at Brockton. It was just, I needed a change. But, that was something I was conflicted about. I for a lot of the time that I was in that job with the Breakers was, feeling that we were doing good work and that we were the, in a lot of ways, the sort of model franchise of WPS, certainly off the field. But it was probably the first time I took a job as feeling really like a hired gun, and sort of from a more mercenary standpoint about taking a job for money and less about sort of passion than the jobs I had taken in my 20s and before I got married. So I've always had a little bit of self-doubt about whether, was I in the right place? Because I was trying to do the best that I could for a business model that I really felt from the beginning was probably doomed to fail.
When did you sort of sense that for the first time?
That the business model was doomed to fail?
Yeah.
When I had the first day that I had lunch with Joe. I'll give you an example. Actually, I have 2 kids under 5, so if you can hear a baby crying in the background,
it's life. Life occurs. Don't worry about it. Unless they're in trouble.
I remember we talked about corporate sponsorship, and Joe said to me, what do you think is reasonable for us to expect for corporate sponsorship relaunching this league? And I told him, at the team that I was at the time, I think, we were doing about $700,000 a year in corporate sponsorship, this independent minor league baseball team. And he said, wow, that's more than I thought. He's like, our goal is about $500,000 the first year. And I said, how does that compare with what the Breakers did the first time in WUSA and what the other teams did in local corporate sponsorship? And he said, well, that would be an all-time record for the WUSA. Nobody did $500,000 locally in the WUSA. And this was after, he had sort of told me about their plans to spend less on advertising and cut back the expenses because WUSA had spent so much. So I said, okay, how many sponsors do you think it'll take to get to the $500,000 mark? And he said, well, our pro forma is, about 10 sponsors at $50,000 each, to do $500,000. And he said, how many do you guys have in Brockton to do 700,000? I said, 114. Because we had the local laundry guy and the real estate guys and the insurance agent on Main Street downtown, and they were all spending $5,000 or $6,000. There's a few people spending 40 or 50, certainly not 10. And one of the challenges was that they were sort of making that price based on the idea of we are the greatest women's soccer league in the world. We will have all of the best players, like WSA did with Mia Hamm and Brandy Chastain and players like that. We'll have the next generation's Mia Hamm and Brandy Chastain. And that's why these sponsorships are worth $50,000. And I said, well, that may be, but you're only going to play 10 to 15 home games with, 4,000 or 5,000 people at each game. I have players that nobody's ever heard of, but we're going to play 50 home games with 5,000 people at each game. So if I'm, the local, regional manager of Bank of America, and neither of you are on TV, why am I giving you $50,000 for 80,000 fans to see me this year when I could give the local minor league baseball team $8,000 for 5 times as many fans? And that's a conundrum that, women's sports haven't really resolved, is that they just don't have the eyeballs, but they want to justify big dollars based on the caliber of play. So that was a challenge. It just wasn't clear how they were going to spend less and make more than they had the first time around. But they were going to spend enough money that they wanted to hire me. So I said, okay.
Well, yeah, and you jumped in, and clearly there had to be something there that compelled you to take a solid crack at it. And frankly, it's probably a little bit more than just the business model, right, and the financial returns of such, but the mindset and the passion behind it, which was this still not fledgling, but premier women's soccer talent in the United States, and seeing it grow and potentially go to higher levels. No.
Yeah, the talent was exciting. I had huge respect for Joe and what he was trying to do. I met the owners. I had huge respect for them. And the other thing is I had just never been able to be part of a startup. Every job that I had been in sports, I'd come in at, I'd been in baseball for the most part, and I'd come in like the team's third or fourth year when they were sort of hitting a bit of a plateau, like the sort of honeymoon phase of getting a new team in your community was wearing off. The season ticket numbers were starting to go down, and I had been part of trying to sort of get past the plateau or reverse a decline in one case after the first couple of exciting years had worn off. But I was sort of inheriting, a marketing plan and a structure and a history in the community. This was a chance to build everything from scratch. So that was probably the most exciting part of it.
And when you became general manager, did it get more complicated, more challenging, or did you feel like you were ascending along with the team and the league into greatness, or at least goodness?
It's hard to recall how I felt now. That's probably 8 years ago, but I liked the challenge. By that point, I'd been there about a year. Joe had decided to move on to something else in soccer. And I had a huge loyalty and belief in the staff that we had, and the opportunity to continue working with them in a leadership position was really exciting. Probably the staff that I had on the 2009-2010 Boston Breakers was the greatest front office group that I've ever been around, and some of those people have gone on to some great jobs. So that was certainly part of it. I really loved the fans and the players. The talent really was remarkable. It was in that league. Like WSA, WPS did a fantastic job on the sort of on-field product piece of getting the best players in the world. I still felt like we were probably in a lot of trouble, but I also took a lot of pride in being part of that organization.
How did the Boston marketplace take to you? Because the Breakers franchise obviously had been perhaps one of the standouts, if not the standout of the previous league, and even to this day, in its NWSL continuation, if you will, it's still a very vibrant marketplace, especially for not just for soccer in general, but for young girls and women in the sport.
Yeah, Boston's a great city for women's soccer. Had amazing players there over the years. The team today is now in a great little stadium on the Harvard campus. When I was there, we played in Harvard's football stadium, which was 30,000 seats. And
not the most modern facility.
It was that was really interesting. Harvard Stadium is on paper, even to the eyeball, just about the worst place you could put a professional sports team of any stripe in the 21st century. I mean, it's just a complete throw. It is a Roman gladiator coliseum. It's concrete berms. There's no seats in the whole place. So you can't do reserve seating. You have to do it general admission. It's dark underneath. The bathrooms are old. The food is not modern. It's artificial turf covered in football lines. I mean, you name it. But for women's soccer, the fact that we could say we played at Harvard worked for us because the audience was entirely from what we called the W towns. If any of your listeners are familiar with Boston, all the wealthiest suburbs, like half of them start with W. Wellesley and Wayland and Weston. so all of the sort of surrounding suburbs of Boston, they're very, very wealthy. That's where the Breakers fans are. And that was one of the big mistakes that the old Breakers had made in WSA. We were lucky when we started the new version in 2007. We had, through Joe, who had been on both front offices, the old season ticket holder lists. And they had about, 2,000 season ticket holders the first time around. And I just started looking at the list, and I knew names on the list from the newspaper. It was like millionaires, just like, heads of the local hospital chains and Boston Red Sox players. And you could look at the zip codes, and there wasn't a blue-collar zip code to be found. There also weren't really corporate season ticket holders. They were almost all held by families. So it really was completely driven by, and this is the case around the league, then and today, the season ticket base is completely driven by the families of youth soccer playing girls. And so for a lot of those families in these affluent suburbs, Harvard's campus is the kind of place they want to be with their daughters on the weekends. It sort of had this aspirational thing for them. One of the other stadiums we looked at in the startup phase was a much more sort of appropriately sized stadium, about a 5,000 seat stadium with where we were offered the concessions contract. So we could have actually controlled the food revenue, which we couldn't do at Harvard. But it was in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which is a very hard scrabble blue collar community with lots of crime and political problems. And we would have failed there because that was not a destination that we were going to get the women's soccer audience to. So
in essence, you had the right location, but the wrong facility in that location.
Yeah, at the time. I think it's now been solved because now there's a sort of 5,000-seater soccer-specific stadium on the Harvard campus that was built for their team. But at the time, that was a big challenge. We managed to overcome it. We sold 1,500 season tickets the first year in the teeth of the recession, which was more than any other franchise in the league. But it was tough. It's a tough sell.
Well, and how about the quality of play? Did in your mind, did the quality of play match the aspirations of what WPS was trying to do in success from the WUSA? I mean, aside from the challenges of trying to market a team and a sport, how was the quality of play? I mean, you're talking about some of the best players in the world, like a Marta, like a Hope Solo, like a Heather Mitz. Was the play good? It seemed to be that it didn't suffer per se by some of the financial issues.
I thought it was great. I'm not the most sophisticated observer of the women's game, and I know there was some criticism that the amount of goal scoring was a bit on the low side. But the league did an excellent job of recruiting the top players. But this is one of those sort of intricacies of the industry, is that it was also one of the things that sort of set them on the road to failure. So the mission of the league, I'm going to botch the wording here a little bit, but the mission statement was something like to be the best women's soccer league in the world and the league by which all other women's sports organizations are judged. Something along those lines. But effectively, the mission didn't speak to the fan experience at all. So for me, coming from minor league baseball, where none of the games matter, the stats don't count effectively, like to me, I came in and it was just all about the fan experience. And I sort of found myself feeling a bit like an alien among the women's professional soccer folks, where it was all about getting either all or at least a quorum of what were perceived to be the best players in the world, because that was the measuring stick of legitimacy. And in a way, I think the league founders boxed themselves into a corner with that mission. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So the founding commissioner was a woman named Tanya Antonucci, who had worked in Yahoo in their digital sports department and had played at Stanford and been a teammate of Julie Foudy at Stanford. And then the COO was a woman named Mary Harvey, who had been a backup goalkeeper on the 96 U.S. Olympic women's soccer team. So two former high-level soccer players and also very accomplished business people. I really liked working with Tanya and Mary. But I think it was a challenge to have two former women's players in the position of being the people who were going to effectively negotiate with the union, or what stood in for the union. And what stood in for the union was the representative of the U.S. national team players, a guy named John Langle. And a lot of people viewed Langle as one of the guys who had sort of helped bring down the WSA, fairly or unfairly, with his demands around player pay and sort of stubbornness to which he held to those demands. So effectively what happened was there was no player union for the WPS players for the first several seasons. So in coming up with things like the league salary cap, those things were negotiated with the de facto union, which was the leadership of the U.S. national team. And those conversations were had with Langle. And my perception is that Langle wiped the floor with WPS leadership. And so the original sort of cost projections that were given to investors kept going up and up and up as they sort of caved to more and more demands. And the other piece was that there was a feeling that there were certain players that the league could not live without. And one of those players was the Brazilian World Player of the Year named Marta.
Sure.
So we got involved in the Marta sweepstakes in Boston because Marta agent, who was a really high-powered agent for some of the top men's Brazilian players.
Well, she was essentially marketed or touted as the Pele, the women's Pele, right?
Yes. So her agent said right from the beginning, there's two places she'll play. She'll play in LA, where the team was owned by AEG, who owned the LA Galaxy and the Home Depot Center, and where the team was going to play. Or she'll play in Boston, where I think, I can't imagine she relished the idea of playing at Harvard Stadium. So I think it was largely because we had such a large Brazilian community in Boston and a really well-respected head coach who was Tony DeCicco, who'd won a World Cup and an Olympic title. So we actually flew her in, and just getting her into town for this sort of negotiation and tour, she needed a suite at the Four Seasons. She needed X amount of first-class tickets from Brazil. She needed a town car. I think we ended up spending more on her weekend visit than a lot of our players made in salary the first year. And we didn't sign her because she wanted $500,000 a year, and we just said there's no way. And the LA team sort of grudgingly agreed to sign her sort of for the good of the league, and then went out of business after 1 year after losing $4 million, way more than anybody else. So they sort of set themselves up to where there was a feeling that they couldn't live without this group of players. The players knew it, and the players were able to just continue driving up the cost on the salary side. One of the really interesting sort of things that happened was there was what's called an allocation process of how to assign the U.S. national team players to the teams. And the WSA had done the same thing. And the challenge was, that even though these salaries were expensive for the owners, say $40,000 a year was what most of the national team players made in WPS, they were, peanuts for a well-educated person, let alone an Olympic or World Cup medalist. So the notion of just having like a draft where, Philadelphia could draft Hope Solo and expect her to move across the country to play for $40,000 was just like preposterous. So what they did was sort of like a matching game where each player would pick the top 3 cities they wanted to play in and rank them from 1 through 3. And then each team would pick 3 players that they wanted and match them 1 through 3. And they would sort of assign players that way.
So it's like a looser version of a draft, per se, with some parameters.
Yeah. And of course, what happens is 16 players rank Bay Area as their number 1 choice, the Bay Area team, let alone all the ones who put Bay Area number 2 and number 3. Nobody puts Philadelphia. That happened in WSA. And in the case of the new league in WPS, not one person put St. Louis. And so you do end up having to put some people in places they don't want to go. But what was really interesting was, some of the players didn't put 3. So a good example was Christine Lilly, one of the greatest players of all time. Had played for the original Breakers, was from New England originally, had married a firefighter in the Boston area, and was 35 or 36 years old and only going to play a couple more years. So she just put Boston number 1 and left number 2 and number 3 blank. Then you had Hope Solo, who basically put out through her agent that she wasn't going to play for $40,000 for anybody, but if someone wanted to offer her a $100,000 contract, then she'd put them number 1. So she basically sold her ranking. Was the only player to do that. And then, so sort of they went through the whole process, and there was a player named Kate Markgraf, who was a longtime U.S. national team player.
Sure.
On the downside of her career, and she had only listed one team. Similar to Christine Lilly, she only listed Chicago. And so on the conference call to hash this all out, the commissioner said to Chicago, okay, so you're going to get Kate Markgraf. And Chicago said, we don't want Kate Markgraf. And it was like this had never occurred to the leadership of the league, the commissioner and COO, that a team might not want a U.S. women's national team player. They were held in such awe and they were such icons that the notion that a franchise might say we'd rather not have this player hadn't sort of occurred. And that to me, that was sort of a red flag of how close the senior leadership of the league was to the sort of labor side of the equation. And the president of Chicago was a guy named Peter Wilt, who's a great guy. He's somebody you should interview, actually.
Sure. I've been Chicago Fire founder. I've been a season ticket holder since day one. And he's sort of the Pied Piper of soccer startups in the United States. Absolutely.
And he's a guy who's really got that sort of minor league fan experience take on things. He really understands sort of what to do for fans. But, he was on this, he was doing this this sort of allocation process. And he's like, we don't want Markgraf. She doesn't really fit with our plan. But we'll take her if you give us a 4th. So he very shrewdly got a 4th allocation that nobody else got in return for taking this player that he either didn't want or claimed to not want. But that was a really illuminating sort of episode because the league was so unprepared for the idea that maybe somebody wouldn't want a national team player on their team.
Now, how did you? So how did the Breakers get Heather Mitts then? Who arguably was probably the I want to call her the pinup girl. I think that would be a bit of a disservice, but obviously as a high wattage marketing draw was clearly somebody that could help you sell, so to speak, the team a bit, right?
Yeah. I think the word that we used internally was glamorous, but in addition to being an excellent player. So we knew we were in a bit of a tight spot because we knew we knew 2 of the 3 players we were going to get, which were Christine Lilly and Angela Hucles, who both lived in Boston, had both played for the original Breakers. We felt like we wanted a really marketable player. Mitts was very marketable, great player, had done some broadcasting when she had played with Philadelphia in the other league. She had dated some Philadelphia Phillies players, and at this point she was, I think, about to become engaged to a Philadelphia Eagles player. So she sort of was known to the celebrity pages, and we felt we could get some marketing there in addition to getting a really good player. And so we really pushed for her. Boston, I don't think, was her number 1 choice. But we intentionally listed her as our number 1 choice, knowing we were going to get the other 2 players we were going to get, to try and compel the league to give her to us. And they did. And that ended up really, most of the earned media that we got, and this is sort of illuminating about the state of women's sports, but most of the earned media we got that first year was really around having Heather Mitts in the team, much more so than, quite frankly, the more talented players that we had, like Kelly Smith, who was the English player and World Player of the Year runner-up to Marta on a couple of occasions, or Christine Lilly. Heather Mitts was the one who got us onto the local sports talk radio station, and she was the one who was on the cover of, Improper Bostonian magazine and all these things. So it was important from an earned media standpoint. And when she left, it left a void on the marketing side for sure.
Well, that's the devil's bargain, right? It's you've got something that is marketable, or a person who is marketable can be, quote unquote, the face of the team. It harkens back to 1974, right? Our listeners will soon know, hopefully, if we're lucky to get him. But Shep Messing famously posed for a little bit more risque, I think, probably than you did with, or Heather did in marketing the Breakers, for Viva magazine, which was a female-oriented publication where he posed essentially in the raw. And, and it drew a lot of attention, not all of it to the soccer purists' delight. But he famously said, and he was absolutely correct, it probably drew more attention to that still fledgling New York Cosmos team he was on than the years prior, or frankly, for the next year or so until Pele came aboard. So it's a tough thing to sort of balance marketing and sizzle with the quality of the product, which arguably is the solid reason why people should keep coming back, right?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's tough for women's sports teams in general is that they tend to get the same article every year, which is the opening day article. Like, they're back. So, you get the feature every year right before opening day. It's the 15th year for the Minnesota Lynx or whatever, and then nothing, And, you get a couple short, you might get the beat report on the score from last night's game, but you really don't get the features in most markets other than sort of opening day, And in the case of Heather Mitts, and also the player that sort of came after her with us was another very glamorous player named Leslie Osborne, who got a lot of the same attention here. It really wasn't anything along the lines of what Shep Messing was doing in the 70s, but it was more that, for example, we could get articles on women's fitness, or articles that were already going to happen on women's fitness, for example, would now cast our players as the cover model. So it really just helped us get into lifestyle branding and lifestyle, honestly, more stuff that women read, the sort of Boston equivalent of Page 6 in the newspaper, the society page and stuff like that, than it was really sex appeal type of stuff specifically. But they get invited to charity runway shows and hip clubs downtown and restaurants and things like that. So it's always tough to attribute value to that. I never got a sense that we were necessarily selling more tickets, but you sort of know that it's better to have that exposure than to not have it.
All right. I don't want to overstay our welcome, and some of these stories are tremendous, and I think will certainly generate even more chatter. Hopefully, once we're up and running. I know I'm giving you a lot for the cutting room floor. No, this is awesome, but I don't want to end without having talking about. I guess two particular areas in the in WPS, some of which I'm sure were I know one was a direct story that you've mentioned on your on funwhileitlasted.net, by the way, and that's your story with Hope Solo when she was playing for St. Louis, and the other is the Magic Jack saga, which in some respects seems like it was almost the microcosm of what became the ultimate demise of the league. But any of those two I'd love to hear. I think our audience would love to hear some of your thoughts there if you're willing.
Yeah, Hope Solo was a fascinating player. One of the all-time greats on the international scene in U.S. soccer. And when the league started up, I was really purely on the business side that first year. But I had the general manager's ear, and from a business perspective, when we were doing that allocation process I referenced, I said, we've got to make a big run at Hope Solo. To me, she was the potential breakout, sort of transcendent player in that U.S. national team group circa 2008. And I have to say that 2008 national team was not it was lacking in personalities. So it was a real concern. They won the Olympic gold medal that year, and they came back to do a victory tour. And this was as the league was getting ready to start. They come back to do a victory tour, and one of the first games was at Giant Stadium, and they drew 4,000 people at Giant Stadium after winning the gold medal. And we just, in the league, we just said, oh shit. These are the players that these are the marketing tent poles for the league, and nobody wants to see their victory tour. Mia Hamm had retired, Julie Foudy had retired, Brandy Chastain was no longer on the national team. So that generation of players that had just captivated America was gone, and the new group was not really resonating. But Hope Solo to me seemed like the sort of breakout character there.
Sure.
She has this sort of superhero name. She is brash, sort of unpredictable, incredibly talented, extremely strong and athletic looking, a tough, gritty player, compelling personal backstory with her father, which is readily available for anybody who's not familiar with it, but worth reading. And incredibly talented and very beautiful, just sort of the complete package, in my opinion. And I had said, we got to put her on the list. And, the soccer side people in the organization, players, coaches, basically had already had a lot of interactions with Hope Solo and basically said, like, you'll have my resignation if you guys get her. They did not want her on that team, period. Some key influential people on that team. So we didn't make a run at her, and she subsequently kind of pulled this, pretty shrewd negotiating move where she circumvented the salary cap and got a $100,000 salary when most of her teammates were getting $40,000. So we wouldn't have wanted to pay that. So we didn't get her. She was okay in WPS. I think she was battling injury a lot of the time that she was in the league. So she actually wasn't one of the greatest goalkeepers in WPS, although she was having tremendous international play at that time. But she came through the second year. She was on the team from Atlanta. And it was a strange game. We were at Harvard Stadium, and it was a game that never should have been played. It was actually a makeup game on the schedule because one of the other franchises in the league in St. Louis, which had been a basket case in the beginning, had folded in the middle of the season abruptly, and it had caused us to cancel a game at home, a home date on like a couple of days' notice that St. Louis was supposed to be in town for.
Never a good sign when you're trying to run a professional sports league.
It was bad. It was the beginning of the end of that league, to be honest. And it was also the biggest advance sale we had for the whole year was that game. So we were expecting a huge crowd, and we lost the game. And so we got this other game added to the schedule against Atlanta on a Wednesday night in the middle of August, which is just an absolute garbage date. We didn't make any attempt to sell it. It would have been a complete waste of time trying to drive group sales or anything else into that date. So we ended up playing in front of like 1,500 people in this 30,000 seat stadium. And you could hear a pin drop. And it was just a complete morgue-like atmosphere. And we usually had, one of the things we did is we hired this Brazilian drumming corps to play at every game, like 20 Brazilian drummers, and they were deafening. And on TV, it sounded amazing. Mm-hmm. And in the stands, it sounded amazing too. And one of the effects that it had is it made a crowd of 5,000 feel like 10,000 because they played nonstop for the whole 90 minutes. But they couldn't make it that night because it wasn't on the schedule that we had given them at the beginning of the year. So they weren't there, and that made it even more silent. So Hope just had a crummy game. She gave up a goal, I think, like 2 minutes into the game, gave up another goal later on. I think we won 2-0. And I was down on the field at the end of the game talking to the Atlanta owner as the beat players were walking over. She kind of walked over and gave him a big hug, walked off the field just like normal, like anybody else. And then I went back to the box office to sort of count the night's game receipts, and an intern came in and said, wow, Hope Solo's blowing up Twitter right now. And it was this big self-righteous tweet decrying the racism of Boston fans and that the Breakers organization condoned this type of behavior. And it was just like sort of baffling. But the book on Hope by this point was that, she needed adversity. She needed to have enemies to thrive, and that if she didn't have them, she'd create them. And so, I took the tweet in and I took it into the locker room, or I actually gave it to Leslie Osborne, who was our team captain. I said, can you go in the locker room and see if the players heard anything? Because what Solo was alleging was that the fans had been directing racist remarks from the stands at two Atlanta players. One was Japanese and one was African American. And so Leslie looked kind of shocked because we'd spent the whole second half pelting Hope Solo with shots, which meant our whole team was basically in the beat half, or the beat side of the field the whole second half, and would have heard whatever Hope heard. But she said, "Oh, okay." And she went in there, and basically the response from the Breakers player was a lot of eye rolling and sort of Hope being Hope sort of comments. So we sort of thought it would blow over in a day. And, when she cooled down, and she'd sort of issue an apology or have the Beat PR department issue a statement of regret of her choice of words. But she actually sort of doubled down on it the next day with all of these very specific allegations of being pelted with rolls of coins and very specific things that were said to this Japanese player and African-American player. And so we investigated it. And we interviewed everybody, the police details, the field personnel. We knew which area of the stands she was talking about. So stadium personnel that weren't employed by us that worked in that area, and nobody could back it up. But, it was very frustrating. And the league basically didn't want to handle it and said, you guys figure it out. So I sort of forgot about it for a couple of years. And then she wrote a memoir shortly after I started the blog. And it actually made it into the memoir as one of the sort of adversities she'd had to overcome, or maybe a case where she had sort of stood up for all that was good and righteous. So at that point, I kind of posted the whole story on the website. And to this day, it's the most read entry on the website. And whenever she does something outrageous, like beat the hell out of her cousin or throw a teammate under the bus, a bunch of people link to it.
Well, I guess some people would look at that as no publicity is bad publicity. And then, while I'm sure that it's challenging to manage that situation, in some respects, there's probably some upside in terms of, I guess, publicity or people paying attention to her or the story. And obviously, where did that story occur? But in a women's professional soccer game. Oh, no, by the way, she'll be in town next week.
Yeah, it's challenging. You really can't really use sort of racism allegations as a
certainly
hook for a playful publicity campaign, although I have to admit it occurred to us. We just, we took it seriously, but when we could find that, when the specifics of what she was saying were just so outlandish and easily disprovable, and nobody could corroborate it, including none of her teammates really coming forward, we did start to get a little silly internally, and she was due to come back one more time when she was on Magic Jack the next year, so that would be a good segue. But we were actually going to hire a courtroom stenographer to sit in the middle of our supporters group section and do a stenography of all of the chants for the entire game, just as a dig at her. And then she ended up not being on the roster for that game.
Well, you brought it up, so let us use that as a final segue here. And am I correct? So in believing, or at least assuming, that the Magic Jack franchise was almost a harbinger, or maybe a smaller yet substantial example of how and why WPS ultimately met its fate after the third year?
No, you are incorrect. Magic Jack was a disaster, and it was fascinating, And it was a really almost sort of incredible foreshadowing of the presidential campaign that we just had this year. But it was not, a turning point or harbinger of doom for the league. The league was already on its course. And I think Dan Borislow, who is the owner of Magic Jack and is now dead, became a very convenient scapegoat for the business failures of the other owners in the league who were already spiraling. So he became, his sort of reign of terror in that league in the final season became the scapegoat for why it didn't go on. But what happened would have happened anyway.
And for our listeners, what the fact that Magic Jack actually existed, right? I mean, what was that story? It seemed like there was almost anarchy from the very beginning, from the very name of the franchise, as well as the, seemingly lack of marketing support or whatever. How would an owner with that kind of, shall we say, latitude even be allowed to run a franchise under those circumstances, maybe to the complete opposite effect of what other teams and owners were doing?
Well, so the guy involved was named Dan Borislow. He actually passed away 2 years ago playing pickup soccer at age 52. He just dropped dead of a heart attack at the end of a match. But in late 2010, after the league's second year, the league was on the verge of going out of business. And one of the teams that was really a linchpin of the league was the Washington Freedom franchise. They were the only team with the same ownership going all the way back to the formation of the WSA. The family who owned them, John and Maureen Hendricks, had really been the founders of WSA. Absolutely. They were the founder of Discovery Channel, and he had roped in the other cable operators that he knew to launch the WSA. And when the other guys had all packed it in after 3 years and folded the WSA, he kept the Freedom alive, playing as a low-level amateur team in the wilderness for 2 or 3 years before the second league started up, and then re-entering them in that league. And they were one of the few franchises that went out and hired experienced sports salespeople and MLS veterans to come in and operate the business side. They had Abby Wambach on the team. It was a very well-operated team, but he grew disillusioned with the other owners in the league. And after 10 years, in the fall of 2010, he said, I'm out. And the president of the team, who was an MLS veteran, knew Borislow or heard of Borislow's interest. And from what I understand, basically just handed him the keys. And I don't think there was a purchase price or anything, but I think, Borislow agreed to keep the team going. But he wanted to move it to West Palm Beach, Florida, where he was from. And the league was just relieved that someone was going to keep it on and keep the league viable and pump some money in. And so they really didn't vet him at all. And, pretty quickly he started being a little bit provocative. He wanted to rename the team Magic Jack, SC, Magic Jack Soccer Club, after his little internet device that, some of your listeners may remember seeing like endless infomercials for back in like 2008, 2009.
Free telephone calls using the internet. Absolutely.
Right. So he had already made $300 million in the late 90s selling his first company to AOL. And now he'd started the second company that was worth, it had an IPO and was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Made a lot of money, spent a lot of money very flamboyantly. He had a 66-foot yacht, and I think he was a member of Mar-a-Lago, Trump's place down in West Palm Beach. And he immediately started assembling basically an all-star squad of U.S. national team players at a time when all the other owners in the league were cutting money to almost a ridiculous degree, cutting salaries to a ridiculous degree. He took advantage of that and sort of stepped into the void and was offering big bucks to come down there. So he had inherited Abby Wambach on the roster, but he quickly added Shannon Box, Christy Rampone, Hope Solo, and all these other players who were free agents either because the teams they had played on had folded or because they were just out of contract or he was able to trade for them. The interesting thing is we had a player at the time named Kelly Smith, who was the second highest payer in the league after Marta. She made $150,000 a year. And the big money guy behind the Breakers, our main owner, said to me, you either need to renegotiate Kelly Smith's contract or I'm going to fold the team. She was making $150,000 a year at the time. And she had basically an ironclad 3-year contract. We were committed to it. And I called her agent and basically said, we need to cut this contract in half. And he just said, go pound sand, basically. And I was at an impasse with the agent. And without telling our head coach, Tommy DeCicco, I emailed Dan Borislow and I said, Kelly Smith is available. He had a player that he inherited from the Washington roster named Nicky Marshall, who we coveted. And I said, trade Kelly Smith to you for Nicky Marshall and, I don't know, a couple draft picks or something. And Dan's reaction was, who's Kelly Smith? Which is really funny because, that's a normal reaction for most American sports fans to have. Greatest English player of all time, but, not a household name in America. But for a guy who is a massive, who's just bought a franchise in the best league in the world and is assembling a squad of, U.S. national team all-stars, it was sort of interesting. It'd be like if a really rich British guy bought Arsenal or Manchester City and started buying up every English national team player. And then Real Madrid called and said, are you interested in Cristiano Ronaldo? And he said, you're going to have to tell me who that is. So he didn't know. He did not care about international players one bit. He was basically, pardon my language, but starfucker who wanted to have a sort of personal toy of having the U.S. national team as his club team. And he did a very good job of assembling the core of that team down in West Palm Beach and put them up in these high-end condos and gave them cars to drive and took them to these lavish dinners. But they quickly discovered that they had to deal with his peculiarities as part of the deal. So among them, he didn't believe in athletic trainers. So he refused to provide the team with athletic training services. He would only provide them with a chiropractor. So, he really treated them shamefully, I would say. And there's a lot of, he always sort of denied these stories as they came out in the media, but, there's a sort of definitive ESPNW article on his year in WPS from 2012, and just the very wide allegations of sort of sexual harassment of players and the way that he interacted with them and the way that he screamed at them on the sidelines. Certainly we saw it in the way he interacted with league officials and the way he demeaned a lot of officials over email, particularly female league officials. And
you call out on your site a story, I guess, of one of the players just literally just yelling back in the middle of the game to his encouragement of the players on the field, and I take it the players didn't really enjoy being watched by the owner.
That was actually Kelly Smith, the player I secretly attempted to trade to him. So he didn't want to play anybody in an exhibition game because he didn't want anybody to see his strategies. But the Breakers were training down in Florida for preseason, and he did have a lot of respect for our head coach. And maybe it was because our head coach had been the U.S. national team coach and had won a World Cup. But he did have a rapport with our head coach, which was sort of rare among his relations with other teams. So he agreed to play us in a preseason game. And this was really the first time that any outsiders had seen what Magic Jack culture was like. And it was incredibly odd. So I had our sort of team traveling secretary call him personally because he had no front office staff. He had Brianna Scurry, the former U.S. national team goalkeeper, as his general manager. It wasn't really clear what she did. There was no other staff. They didn't have a team website. They didn't advertise or promote the schedule of their games in the West Palm Beach community at all. He had no interest in doing that. The team played really for the amusement of he and his family, effectively. And so we went down there, and our had somebody on our staff contact him and say, okay, here's when our bus is arriving for the game tomorrow, yada yada yada, and here's what we'd like to eat after the game. I think it was like pizza or something, and he was like, I'm not buying you food. And we said, no, this is like standard operating procedure. You're going to find this when we get to the regular season, Dan. So we'll help educate you on how the sort of standard operating guidelines, but you need to provide a spread of food for the players after each game. And he's like, that is absurd. That's ridiculous. I'm not going to get you guys food. And so I just said, okay, I was up in Boston. I said to my the manager down in Florida, I was like, here's my credit card. Just if there's no food for you, just take the players out and give them some food and keep it reasonable. So we go down there. We play the game. Borislaw's on the sidelines, yelling at his players as if they're like 8-year-old youth soccer players. So he's got U.S. national team players playing in the World Cup, dribbling up the field, and he's yelling like, "Look behind you! They're coming up behind you!" As one of our players would approach, and just barking at these girls like they're 8-year-olds who've never played before. And finally, Kelly Smith just turned to him, and Kelly Smith was a tough player who didn't take shit from anyone, and she knew exactly who it was, and she just yelled over him and said, "Shut the fuck up!" And our athletic trainer was put in an awkward position because she got down there, and all the Magic Jack players walked across the field and said, "Could you please tape our ankles?" Because Dan won't get us an athletic trainer. So she ended up, furiously taping ankles to try and get both teams ready before the game started. And then the game ended, and we had no idea if there was going to be any food. And Dan takes both teams out unannounced to a extravagant dinner at some club where all of the wait staff were wearing tuxedos and tails, and spent thousands and thousands of dollars feeding both teams after refusing to buy us pizza the day before. So that was just sort of, and it got weirder. And like I said, he just defied every social norm and stricture of being part of the league. And I don't just sort of mean in the way he spoke to people, but, we had a precious few national sponsorship contracts with Puma and a few others, and he simply refused to honor them. He wouldn't put up field boards with Puma on them, which every other team in the league did as part of this long-standing, multi-million-dollar sponsorship deal. He was mad at Puma because of something or other, and he just refused to do it and didn't want to spend money on it. So he really was I have to say, we did a couple of trades with him during the year, and felt sort of conflicted about it because, we sort of rescued a few players from that team, but it also meant we sent a few players to that team. And, you sort of heard what was going on down there, and it wasn't a place that you wanted to send anybody. Only one player has ever come out and sort of given a full account of what that year was like. It was a younger player named Ella Mazar. And she posted a report, which you can still find online if you Google Ella Mazar, M-A-S-A-R, Magic Jack. And it is beyond belief, really. And none of her other teammates really came out to support her publicly. But privately, these were all things that we had been hearing for a year. And there's also a big difference in the way he treated the U.S. national team players and the players who weren't of that level. And I think one of the real scandals of that, which has been reported on a little bit by ESPNW and Deadspin and others, but is largely sort of a forgotten anecdote in women's soccer history at this point, is the degree to which some of these very senior U.S. national team players did not stand up to him while witnessing the way he treated a lot of the players in that team. And I think that will always be a bit of a blight on the careers of several very prominent players. Their sort of ongoing loyalty to him, which they were never able to give a justification beyond a large paycheck. And some of the things that they witnessed that they didn't really seem to do much to address. So it was a very difficult circumstance. The league ended up revoking his franchise after 1 year. At that point, he had a pending grievance filed against him by the players' union of the league, which was actually the only action that union ever took in its brief existence. And so the league was, the team was taken away from him, and the league folded a few months later and sort of blamed him and the lawsuit with him that resulted as the result for its demise. But the reason, to your question as to why was he able to run amok, was that the league had sort of allowed itself to degrade to the point where a person like that could come in and exploit the lack of expertise and experience and weakness that was the result of getting rid of most of the kind of experienced executives and administrators and gutting the league office in the months before he came in.
Well, on that happy note, so I'd love to go deeper on some of these things, and frankly, I'd love to over time perhaps revisit some of these stories and maybe even go a little bit deeper, because those 3 years, and frankly even the years prior, the WUSA, are not only interesting stories and whatnot, but you're talking about and now frankly a seemingly thriving and well-managed women's league today. That's all part of the history, right? It's part of the history of soccer in this country, and it's also in particular the separate and refined history of women in soccer in this country. And you were frankly a witness to a whole bunch of it, and the fact that you were willing to be open about some of those things, as well as just being frankly taking a chance on a flyer on little old me for this this podcast, for wherever it goes. Hopefully it'll be something that will return in kind. So I want to thank you, but I also want to tell our listeners again, this is just scratching the surface of the fun and frivolity that you'll be exposed to on Andy's amazing site. It is, I think of it as almost the Wikipedia for all things forgotten in sports. It's called funwhileitlasted.net. And something we didn't even get a chance to talk about, but you should also check out, is there's a component of it called Minor League Paper, which is Andy's eBay site, where you will find a treasure trove of WPS and other forgotten sports league and team memorabilia. It is fascinating. You will lose a lot of time by being on it. You will want to purchase many of those items, as I have done in the past. And it's just it's a fascinating treasure trove of information and items. And again, Andy, I can't thank you enough for being the first sort of guinea pig for this effort. You're a treasure trove of information, and I'd love to not only thank you, but hopefully keep in touch for, I would hope, a return appearance at some point soon.
Yeah, that would be great. It's a pleasure, and I'm really excited to see how your project develops.
All right, that is our episode for this week. Thank you to Andy Crossley for coming on the show, being one of our first subjects, if you will, one of our first guests. Kind and gentle soul is he, and a trooper to boot. His website, must visit. It's called funwhileitlasted.net. I guarantee you'll have a good time on that site. You will find a treasure trove of stories and remembrances about teams and leagues that either you remember or frankly never knew about. It's fascinating and endlessly so. There's an eBay site in there as well. You can see and purchase various memorabilia from said teams and leagues. It's just fascinating. As for us, please go to iTunes next time you're there. Please feel free to rate and review us highly. We love 5 stars in particular. And our website, of course, is goodseatsstillavailable.com. You can leave us an email there. You can sign up for our email list to be notified about various things. And of course, on social media, you can find us on Twitter at goodseatsstill. We're on Instagram as well with Good Seats still available. And you'll also find us on Facebook. Tim Hanlon here saying thank you. Look forward to much more in the weeks and months to come. And take care, everybody.